on investments in India. A lot of you folks have investments in India, I'm pretty sure, and are here to figure out how you can handle them, how you can manage the cash flow from them, and also figure out if you decide to sell them, whether it's inherited or purchased, how you can handle that transaction. So just to give you a background, I had a property in Bangalore that I sold in 2012, and I wish I had met Isha and Gangaraju back then, or at least heard about it, because I kind of had to navigate this on my own. And so one of the things I'd like to think about when I put these webinars together is to think about the pain point that people are going through and figure out what can I bring to you guys that will help ease that pain point. And I'm excited to have our guest speakers on today, Isha and Gangaraju, talking about this topic of investments in India and how to handle the repatriation, as well as taxation of properties and other funds that you might have in India. Isha is a chartered accountant and a partner at Ajay Shekri and Company. Prior to this, she worked as a consultant with Ernst & Young and has more than 10 years of experience in cross-border taxation and regulatory aspects. Mr. Gangaraju Hanumaya is the founder and CEO of Right TaxMate. Prior to Right TaxMate, he was a part of the My Tax Filer team. He has a lot of experience also. I think he's from Ernst & Young, and he is an enrolled agent right now, admitted to practice before the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. I think everybody's familiar with that, and has over 13 years of experience in the US tax industry. So between the two of them, they cover bases from both ends of the spectrum, whether it's in India or here, and I'm excited to have them on board today. So a couple of things you're going to learn from this webinar is understanding the manner of holding immovable property in India and repatriation of not only when you sell, but current income like rent, issues on capital gains tax in India on the sale of properties, exemptions available for capital gains in India, income tax and withholding taxes in India for capital gains, as well as tax and regulatory implications on repatriation of income to the US. So those are all the cool things you're going to learn today, and I hope you walk away with a lot of information, including Paras, who's calling us from Mumbai. And thanks again, Isha, for talking to us this early in the morning in India. As always, this is an educational webinar. If you want a specific solution for your problem, please consult with Isha or with Gangaraju after the webinar for your specific situation. We always provide general information here, so it's not meant to solve your specific situation here. Sorry, Isha says someone's trying to join in. I don't really have a direct link. He should have gotten the link, Isha, if they registered for the webinar.
Okay, sure. Thanks.
Sorry, not very helpful right now. Just a few housekeeping items. Everyone's on mute except the panelists, as always. Please find the Q&A box to ask the questions, because it just helps me track the questions better. Also, I do record this webinar. I get a ton of emails after the webinar asking if it will be sent. Yes, it will be. Please whitelist my email or add my email to your contact list, so it'll go to your inbox. A quick update on upcoming webinars. We have a webinar on October 8th at 7:30 p.m. Central, which is our usual slot on Thursday. And this will be a different kind of webinar. It'll be a panel discussion called Penniless to Success. It's a story of 3 immigrants who came here with virtually nothing and financially freed themselves from their jobs to start their own successful businesses. So just want to hear their stories, share their stories, and inspire more people. I'm also very excited to announce this event I'm putting together with 3 of my partners. It's called Passive Investor Ed 2020. And we have some amazing speakers on here: Vinny, Frank Rolfe from Mobile Home Parks, Neil Bava, Clint Coons, Ryan Gibson, who'll talk about self-storage. So we have covered, it's our intention in this 2 days, over a span of 2 days, to cover every asset class out there and bring the best speakers, including senior living and more. If you're interested, please mark your calendars. Visit us at passiveinvestored.com. We have coming soon website and some information for you guys there already, but we don't have the registration and payment links yet. It will be priced very competitively, so it'll be a two-day online virtual event and deliver a lot of value to you all. I also have a YouTube channel, so I always post a lot of information, including these webinars on it. So please subscribe and to keep track of these webinars. You can also join me on Purely Passive Investor Group on Facebook. So it's been, I think, 700 people and growing. So we share a lot of investor related information here. A little bit about me. A lot of folks know me, but today I have a bunch of people that haven't probably met me before. I'm from Bangalore. I moved here in '98. I have a master's degree in computer science, and I defected from technology to real estate last year after spending 20 years within working for IBM and Atlassian. I have been financially independent since 2019, and I started a company called Cherry Street Investments, which I bring these educational events. I do passive investments in real estate across multifamily and senior living, as well as I have an insurance agency which focuses on high cash value policy for investing, college planning, and retirement. And I also provide real estate brokerage services. With that, I normally introduce all our guest speakers, but in the interest of time, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I'll hand it off to Isha there.
Thanks, Kavita. So a little bit, so first, good evening, everyone, and good morning to me. It's 6:40 a.m. for me. So I'm a chartered accountant from Mumbai, India. I have been working as a CA since over 10 years. I have cross-border tax and regulatory experience. I regularly give these kind of seminars, and I do write a lot of articles. So with that quick introduction, I'm going to start the presentation now. Is my screen clear, the presentation?
Yes.
All right.
Perfect.
So today we are going to discuss the tax and regulatory issues that arise on sale of property held in India and remitting the money from India to the US. My counterpart, Ganga Raju, will deal with the issues from a US perspective. So let's start, and you can ask your questions in the chat box and we can take them up post the presentations. So what we will start with are the important definitions which you need to understand for the purpose of this presentation. We will also be discussing how you can acquire, hold, sell the property, some allied issues. We'll be covering some basic FAQs, and we'll also be taking up a case study. Now, let's discuss the fundamental definitions which are important for our discussion today, because these words will come up more than once in the presentation, so it's important for us to get the meanings right. To start with, who is considered as a non-resident Indian? So a lot of people will call themselves NRIs, PIOs, OCIs, and somehow the distinction is not clear. So let's first understand who is an NRI. A NRI is a non-resident Indian. This is a person who holds an Indian passport but resides outside India. The second is a PIO, a person of Indian origin. A person of Indian origin is a person who is a non-Indian passport holder and is eligible to and has obtained an OCI card, which is an Overseas Citizen Card of India. The third category is a foreign citizen non-resident. This is a person who is a non-Indian passport holder and is not eligible to obtain the OCI card. So the distinction between these are important is because if you are a non-Indian passport holder and do not hold an OCI card, the regulations are stricter. And a lot of the general exemptions and permissions that are available to NRIs and PIOs do not extend to a foreign citizen non-resident. Now that we have these basic definitions clear, we can go on to discuss about repatriation, because that is the main topic, right? So first, let's understand what is repatriation. Repatriation is basically a term used under the Indian Foreign Exchange Management Act, which is also known as FEMA, for remittance of your Indian rupees in your bank account in India to your overseas bank account. The Indian government understands the need for NRIs and PIOs to remit the money outside India and has given a general permission to remit up to USD 1 million per financial year, and financial year in India is April to March. And there are no questions asked here, and there is no approval required. So even if you remit 1 million in March 2021, you are eligible to remit another 1 million in April 2021. Obviously, after April 2021, you cannot remit till March 2022. This limit is per person. All you need to do here is submit certain documents to your bank and you're good to go, and you can actually remit this money outside India. Now, the first thing you need to know as an NRI or PIO is the kind of bank account you hold in India. So basically, there are three types of bank accounts in India. There is a non-resident external account known as NRE. There's a non-resident ordinary account, which is known as NRO. And there is a foreign currency non-resident account known as FCNR. The first category, NRE and NRO, are primarily funds denominated in INR in India. A FCNR account is a foreign currency account for non-residents in India. The most important distinction to understand is that the NRE account, the non-resident external account, is considered as a freely repatriable account. So this is akin to having your funds outside India itself. And if you have any funds in the NRE account, you need not submit even any documents to the bank. They will ask for one simple form, if at all, and that's about it. They will not ask you any further questions. This amount is freely repatriable to your account overseas. If you are holding your NRO and FCNR account and you have funds lying there, then you do need to give certain type of documentation to the bank. So based on all of these guidelines, if you go to your bank to ask them to repatriate the money, they will first check the type of bank account you're holding. If it is your NRO or FCNR account, they will check the nature of the transaction as well, the source of the money that has come there. They will check the amount of the money that you want to repatriate. Any current income, which is interest, dividends, rent, which is which can be deposited in your NRO account, can be remitted outside India after payment of taxes. Now, NRO account works like a saving account in India, and any other Indian resident can freely deposit money into your NRO account. There are no questions asked by the bank when any Indian resident deposits money into your NRO account, which is why most of your current income does get deposited in the NRO account. Whenever you want to repatriate your money from your NRO account, the bank will ask for certain documents. So all you need to do is reach out to your bank. They'll ask for certain documents like your Form A2, a declaration, and maybe some certificates. We will deal with the actual documentation requirements later. This was to understand the concept of repatriation and what is allowed. Now, since the topic is sale of immovable property, let's understand from an India perspective, what is immovable property and what is included. So immovable property includes land, including agricultural land, building, apartments, and even rights in an under construction property. It also includes perpetual tenancy rights, otherwise also known as pagdi property in India. It also includes long-term lease rights in a property, where the ownership rests with the government, like a collector property. So a lot of properties in India are actually owned by the government and given on a long-term lease. Whenever we talk about immovable property, all these different kinds of rights associated with the property are also included. So now that we have discussed these fundamental definitions, we can go on to discuss the acquisition of the immovable properties. So for NRIs and PIOs, there are three modes for acquiring immovable property in India. The first is purchasing the property for self-use or for giving out on rent. For this, the payment can only be made through a bank account, which is held in India or outside India. So the main criteria to understand here is that any other mode of payment is not allowed. Traveler's checks, for example, are not allowed. You can only make the payment through the bank account. That doesn't matter whether it's NRE, NRO, FCNR in India, or you're remitting the money from outside India. The second is receiving a gift from a relative who is a resident or an NRI or a PIO. Now, if it comes from the third category, where you are a foreign citizen and not having an OCI card, then a prior RBI approval is required. The third way is by inheritance. Now, inheritance obviously can be from anyone. If it is from a NRI or PIO, they should have acquired the property under the FEMA regulations or from another Indian resident. If it is from a foreign citizen who is a non-resident, while you can inherit the property, you can only hold the property if you take approval from the RBI to hold it. If it is from a resident in India, you can inherit any kind of property, including agricultural land. We will discuss agricultural land a little later. Now that we've discussed acquisition, let's go on to understanding the do's and don'ts for individuals holding the property. If you have the property, you can let it out, you can receive rent, and you can remit this money outside India after payment of taxes in India. However, you cannot deal in real estate trading or transferable development rights, also known as TDRs. The logic being that you're not allowed to carry out business in real estate, but holding it as an investment or for self-use is permitted. So that is the whole logic behind it. You can hold it, you can use it for your investment, you can use it for self-use, you can get rent, but no kind of business activity is allowed. When you had to come to sell the property, you can sell the property to any person other than a foreign citizen non-resident and repatriate the sale proceeds abroad. There is a law which specifically says that a non-resident, or NRI or PIO, can only remit money freely for 2 residential house properties in India. Now, this is a lifetime limit. However, since there's a general permission already available of USD 1 million per year, any other third residential property, fourth residential property can always fall under the 1 million scheme. Also, there is no real way for the Indian government to track it because they aren't really taking any declarations to this effect. And it is also not wrong because you anyways have a general permission available. You can also bequeath your property to anyone, including foreign citizen non-residents, but they will require RBI approval to continue holding the property. I will be mentioning RBI approval a few times, but just letting you know that an RBI approval could take between 1 to 3 months, and you will need to engage with someone in India who's a RBI consultant to get this approval. They do give it easily, but it is procedural and could take between 1 to 3 months. Now let's discuss the transfer of the property. who can you transfer it to and how? If it is a NRI or PIO seller and it is non-agricultural land property or any other immovable property, you can sell or gift it to any other Indian resident, NRI or PIO. You cannot sell or gift it to a foreign citizen who's a non-resident. If it is agricultural land, then you can only sell or gift it to an Indian resident. And now, since we've been talking about agricultural land, let's understand the basic rules on agricultural land. What is allowed? In general, a NRI or PIO cannot acquire any kind of agricultural land, plantation house, or a farmhouse in India. That is not permitted. In fact, India has, some states in India have very strict laws that even Indian citizens cannot purchase agricultural land in India. So for example, in the state of Maharashtra where we live, I as an Indian citizen resident in India, cannot purchase agricultural land in India. I need to have an agriculturist certificate. And only then can I even purchase agricultural land in India. So there are different state regulations that are also applicable in addition to the FEMA regulations. Now, subject to the state regulations, if you did acquire the agricultural land when you were a resident, or it was inherited by you from a person who's an Indian resident, you are, as an NRI or PIO, allowed to hold the agricultural land, but you're not allowed to carry out any agricultural activities on the land. For agricultural land, you can only sell it to Indian residents, and what we just discussed, it can only be subject to the state laws. So not all states will allow you to even sell it to Indian residents. So now that we have discussed the acquisition, holding, and the transfer of the immovable property, on immovable property, the tax that is payable is called capital gains tax. So when you sell your immovable property, the gains that are calculated are known as capital gains, and tax is payable thereon. Capital gains, the rate of capital gains differs depending upon whether they are long term or they are short term. If your asset has been held for more than 24 months, it is known as long term capital gains. If it is held for 24 months or less, it is known as short term capital gains. The main reason for bringing this up is that if it is a long-term capital gains, the rate of tax is lower. It's 20% plus applicable surcharge and cess that we will discuss later. If it is short-term, which is 24 months or less, the rate of tax is higher. It is 30% plus applicable surcharge and cess. Also, there are certain exemptions available for long-term capital gains. These are discussed a little later, which are not applicable to short-term capital gains. Now, very important to note that in the case of a gift or in the case of inheritance, the period for which the previous owner held the asset is also included to determine whether it is long-term or short-term. So for example, you received a gift of an immovable property and you received it only in, say, March of 2020. However, your father has been holding that property for the past 6 years. In that case, even if you sell the property in September 2020 or in October 2020, where your period of holding has only been 6 months, but the time period for which your father owned the property for the past 6 years is also considered to determine whether it is long-term or short-term. So in this case, it will be considered as long-term. So there is a specific income tax formula, computation formula for capital gains. This basically includes deducting the cost of acquisition and certain expenses from the sale consideration and then arriving at the capital gains and then the tax payable thereon. Now that we've discussed these basic points, let's go on to understand the points you should keep in mind while agreeing to the sale consideration. Now, in India, there is a concept of a deemed sale consideration, a value which is considered as the base. If your transaction is done below this value for the purpose of payment of capital gains tax in India, the higher deemed sale consideration is considered. That means that you will be paying tax on an amount which you haven't even received. So this is very important to note because a deemed sale consideration can have tax implications on you and you may not even be aware of them. So what is this value, this base value? This base value is known as a stamp duty reckoner value. So it's called a reckoner rate value in a lot of cases and people generally refer to it as that. This value is provided by each state each year. So it is not a central, it is not a rate that is provided by the center. Each state provides these rates each year. They are provided either on 1st of January, 1st of April. This year they were provided even on 1st of September. This deemed sale consideration is applicable to all immovable property. It only does not apply to perpetual tenancy rights. So whether it is land, agricultural land, building, even rights in an under construction property, to all of these kind of rights in their land, these stamp duty reckoner rates are applicable. So before you agree on your sale consideration with your buyer, please check the stamp duty reckoner value. This value is very, very easily available with your broker. And please ensure that your sale consideration is your stamp duty reckoner value or higher. So let's take an example. The agreed sale consideration is 2 crores, but the stamp duty reckoner value is 2.4 crores. So in this case, your deemed sale consideration will be considered as 2.4 crores, not as 2 crores, and you will be paying tax on an additional 40 lakhs. So this is very, very important to remember. And any stamp duty that is also payable or chargeable on the transaction is also always charged on the stamp duty reckoner value itself and not on the sale consideration. On account of COVID currently and to give a boost to the real estate sector in India, as of now, there are certain concessions available to what we just discussed. So from an income tax perspective, this deemed sale consideration can be up to 10% lower than the stamp duty value. This is currently available maybe till March 2021. I'm not sure if they'll extend it beyond that. So that is available. So if you're doing your transaction now, then this 10% concession is available. A lot of states in India have also reduced the stamp duty rates for transactions till March 2021. So if you're considering doing a transaction right now, there are a lot of buyers available in India because of the reduced stamp duty rates. So like, for example, in the state of Maharashtra, they have actually reduced a 5% rate to a 2% rate till December 2020, and they've reduced it to 3% till March 2021. But this is only a current concession till March 2021. It may not apply beyond it. So now that we've discussed the sale consideration, let's understand what are the allowable expenses. You can claim the cost of acquisition, which was actually used to purchase the property. In India, there is a concept called indexation. So a cost inflation index is a measure provided by the Indian government to adjust for the inflation. Now, the base year of this is 2001. So that is 1st April 2001 is considered as the base date. These index values are issued each year and they are applicable to each financial year. So they're applicable from April 2001 to March 2002. And this index will then change in April 2002. That's how it works. So currently from April 2001 to the year 2020, to April 2020, it has roughly gone up by 3 times. So the cost inflation index was 100 for the base year and it's 301 today. So if you purchase something for 5 lakhs in 2001, the current value that you will be allowed as a deduction is 15 lakhs. Now, if you purchase the property prior to 1/4/2001, at your option, you can either use the stamp duty reckoner value on 1/4/2001 or the actual cost. This is your option. This option of substituting the stamp duty value as on 1 April 2001 is not available to tenancy rights. This also helps in cases where, this was an old property, ancestral property, where you do not have documents, where you do not know what was the actual purchase price. This also helps in those cases. In case of a gift or an inheritance, the cost to the previous owner is considered. So similar to the fact that the period of holding by the previous owner is considered, the cost to the previous owner is also considered. And we've already discussed the indexation. The second cost that is allowed is a cost of improvement. So if you have made any capital expenditure for additions or alterations, which enhances the value of the asset or increases its price, like any major changes like adding a floor to a bungalow, for example, that is a cost of improvement. And if you have the details, you can claim those expenses as well. However, regular repairs and renovation are not included. If you had done these changes before 1 April 2001 and you are using your value as on 1 April 2001, it is deemed to be included in that value. The third expense you can claim as the actual transfer expenses. So your brokerage, any commission, in case of a tenancy right purchase, you may have to make certain payments to the tenant. In case of the government-owned property, you may have to make certain payments to the government. All those expenses are allowed to be claimed. Legal expenses like drafting of the agreement, even though they are directly attributable to the transfer, are generally not allowed by the tax authorities in India. And the other expenses in relation to the transfer, like for example, stamp duty, registration, society transfer charges, they're generally borne by the buyer. But a lot of times, sellers do agree to to share these expenses. In case you pay for them, these can also be claimed as an expense. Now let's take an example. A property was purchased in 1998 for a cost of 5 lakhs. And the fair market value, the stamp duty value was 4.6 lakhs as on 1 April 2001, which is slightly lower than the actual cost. The property is sold in September 2020 for 1 crore. And there is brokerage of 1 lakh that is paid. Now for the cost, you can either use 5 lakhs or 4.6 lakhs at your option, which will be indexed. We will obviously choose the higher one. And the cost allowable is roughly 3 times today. So that becomes 15 lakhs. And the capital gains the capital gains will be about 84 lakhs. Then there's tax of about 19 lakhs payable on this. And after deducting the expenses and cost and the taxes, around 80 lakhs is available for you to repatriate right now itself. This slide shows the capital gains tax rates for individuals. So while your base rate is 20%, there is a cess which is applicable to everyone, which is at the rate of 4%. I have mentioned the slabs above, And depending upon the slabs here, the surcharge gets added and increases as well. And the tax rate below is the effective tax rate, including the surcharge and cess. Now, this is on the capital gains income, not on the sale consideration. So, for example, you sell an asset for 5 crores, but you have costs included in it. And so your capital gains only works out to say 2 crores. So 2.5 crores. Then you come in the 2 to 5 crore bracket, and the effective tax rate applicable to you is 26%. Now, this is for all your income. So if you have other income in India, that gets added here as well. So you have other income in India, and because of which your income is going above 5 crores, then the effective tax rate applicable to capital gains will be 28.5%. Now let's understand how the payment will be made to you. So ideally, as per Indian tax laws, the purchaser in India should withhold taxes at the effective rate, which is between your 20.8% to 28.5% on the sale consideration, not on the amount of capital gains, on the sale consideration, on the gross amount itself. However, a lot of purchasers in India are not aware of this provision, and they may only deduct 1% TDS or not withhold any taxes at all. In case no taxes have been deducted by them, then you are liable to pay advance tax at the time when your gains happen. Otherwise, there will be an interest added when you file your return. If the purchaser does inform you, so he's a well-informed purchaser in India and informs you that no, I will withhold taxes at the effective rate on the sale consideration, you as a seller have the option to apply for a lower withholding tax certificate from the Indian government. This could take 2 to 3 months, and there would be some cost involved here. It is also mandatory for you to file your income tax return in India for that year. In case there is a refund, because if the purchaser is withholding taxes on the sale consideration and not on the capital gains amount, there will be an amount which will be refundable to you. It doesn't matter that you have not filed returns for prior years where you didn't have income chargeable to tax in India, but for that year, it is mandatory for you to file your tax returns. The due date of filing tax returns in India is 31st of July each year. Now, here is a quick summary. You find a purchaser, agree on the sale consideration, ensure that it is higher than the stamp duty reckoner value. You determine your cost as on 1 April 2001 if purchased prior to that. You check with the buyer if they want to withhold taxes, and then consider whether you want to apply for a lower withholding tax certificate. And you pay the income tax and remit the money outside India. Now, coming to the repatriation of the sale proceeds. As we discussed earlier, there is no approval required. There are only certain forms to be submitted to the bank. The repatriable investment, that if you've purchased it in foreign exchange, it can be allowed up to 2 residential house properties. And any other investment up to $1 million can be repatriated each year between April to March. Now, what are the documents required for making the repatriation? The purchaser of the property has 2 options. One, he can remit to your NRO account in India, in which case he is not bothered with the documentation at all. Second, he can agree with you that he will remit the money outside India to your bank account. This rarely happens though. If he does agree and he's feeling generous, then all the documentation is to be done by the purchaser. There is nothing else required at your end. If the purchaser remits to your bank account in India and they will remit to your NRO account, then you can submit the documents to the bank. You may have to give a declaration that taxes have been paid. Now, all banks in India ask for a 15C and 15CB. So while this was a requirement earlier under law, maybe up till 2015, from 2015, this requirement has actually been removed. However, banks still ask for it for some reason. But if you do explain to them that it is not required, which we have done in all our cases, it is possible not to submit these documents because it is actually not required by law. The challenge today with the Form 15CA is actually that it needs to be digitally signed by you as the NRI or PIO. Now, obtaining a digital signature in India needs you to get your documents apostilled from the Indian embassy in the US. And so it's a procedural hassle, honestly, to get it done. Obviously, there's some cost also involved, but the transaction gets delayed because of it and for something which is not required. The code that should be mentioned is S1301. And if you mention this code, Form 15C and CB are not required. There are certain capital gains exemptions available in case you want to reduce your tax liability. In the case of a sale of a residential house property, you can purchase or construct another house property subject to certain conditions, and you can even invest in capital gains bonds subject to certain conditions. I'm not going through these right now because our topic is repatriation. So in case somebody wants further details, they can always get in touch with us. If you sell other than a residential house property, you can buy another residential house property, again, subject to certain conditions. Now let's look at the allied issues. The first being the title deeds of a property. Now, as a seller, please ensure that all the original title deeds of the property with the entire trail are available with you. Otherwise, the process involves filing an FIR in India, giving a newspaper advertisement, and this process itself can take up to 3 months, which may involve you coming to India more than once. So we had this case that happened last year, and our client, along with his wife, because it was a jointly held property, and he didn't have the entire trail of documents, needed to keep coming to India each time something needed to be filed, and it actually delayed the transaction by more than 3 months. So please always ensure that the original title documents with the entire trail are available. Then what happens in case of change of residential status from resident to NRI? You can continue holding your properties, but are not allowed the real estate trading or agricultural activities. In case of change of your citizenship, of course, you can continue holding the property, but please get your OCI card. Otherwise, you're considered as a foreign citizen, non-resident. If you become, or as an NRI or foreign citizen, you become a resident in India, you can obviously continue holding your property. Now, let's discuss certain FAQs. So, as an NRI or PIO, I have purchased a property in India. Are there any documents to be filed with the Reserve Bank of India after the purchase or sale of property? No, you are not. There are no specific documents to be provided to the RBI, but it should be as per the permitted categories that we have discussed before. Question 2, I have inherited 2 properties and I have purchased 1 property in India. How many residential or commercial properties can a NRI or PIO purchase or hold under the general permission? So the answer here is there is no limit. You can hold as many properties. There is no problem at all. Question 3, can my wife, who is a foreign national of non-Indian origin, who qualifies in the foreign citizen non-resident account, can be a second holder to any immovable property purchased by me? So the answer here is yes, but for only 1 immovable house property, subject to the fact that the payment for this property is made by a bank account held outside India or in India, and you have been married for more than 2 years at least, and your wife is not otherwise prohibited under FEMA. So for example, being a citizen or having a passport of say Bangladesh or Pakistan, that is anyways not allowed. So you have to also check that she is not otherwise prohibited under FEMA. I have a residential house property. Can I mortgage it? Yes, you can to a bank in India without any prior permission. But if you want to mortgage it and you want to take a loan outside India and you want to mortgage it with a bank outside India, you have to take prior permission of the RBI. Question 4, I want to purchase a property in India, which will be part from my funds held in my bank account and part by traveler's checks. Is this allowed? No, as we discussed earlier, it has to be only made from funds held in bank account. It can be in India or outside India. Question 5, I had booked an under construction flat. The booking has been cancelled. How do I repatriate the money to the US? So this is allowed to be repatriated, provided the original payment was made from NRE or FCNR account or as inward remittance through normal banking channels, and your bank is satisfied about the genuineness of the transaction. If the payment was made from NRO account, you will have to go under the USD 1 million scheme. If the builder actually refunds the money with interest, then you have to pay applicable income tax on the interest component only, and then the rest of it can be credited to your NRE or repatriated outside India. Question 6, I received an immovable property as a gift from my relative. I have sold the property. Can the purchaser remit the money directly to my bank account outside India? So if you receive a gift from a relative and then sell the property, because the money was not paid by you, this money can only initially be credited to your NRO account in India and then can be repatriated under USD 1 million scheme. Question 7, can I take a loan for my property in India? Yes, you can take a loan if it is for a residential property. It could be for the purchase, repair, renovation, or improvement of your residential accommodation. If you have any deposits, fixed deposits in NRE, NRO, FCNR, there are eligible limits. You can take it from bank and other credit institutions as per their norms. And the repayment can be made through any bank account, either in India or outside India. And even your close relatives, mother, father, sister, brother, wife, children, can also make payment for this through debit through their account in India. Question 9, I have not filed my income tax return in India for the past several years. Since there was no income chargeable to tax in India, do I need to file it in the year in which the property is sold? Yes, it is mandatory to file it in the year in which your property is sold. It doesn't matter if it hasn't been filed for prior years. And now we're going to very quickly take a case study in 2 minutes and end my presentation. So there's Mr. A, who is an NRI, and he inherited agricultural land and a flat from his grandfather in 2015 in India. The grandfather had purchased the agricultural land in 1997 for a cost of 2 lakhs, and the flat was purchased in 2002 for a cost of 5 lakhs. Mr. A has now found another NRI purchaser to sell the agricultural land and the flat. The sale consideration is for the land is 1 crore and for the flat is 2 crores. The stamp duty reckoner values for the agricultural land is 1.2 crores and for the flat is 1.9 crores. The NRI purchaser wants to transfer the money from his NRO account to Mr. A's NRO account in India. Now, how can Mr. A remit the money to his bank account inside India, and what will be the tax liability in India? So in this case, the first important point to note is that Mr. A cannot sell the agricultural land to an NRI. That is not permitted. He will have to find another purchaser who is an Indian resident and subject to state laws for the sale of the agricultural land. Further, he needs to ensure that the sale consideration is higher than the stamp duty reckoner value. The capital gains tax shall be payable in India, and post payment of these taxes, Mr. A can remit the money outside India. He can reach out to his bank and ask for the documentation required. So this is all from me. Thank you very much. I hand it over to Kavita and Ganga Raju.
Hey, Isha, do you want to take the questions, or should we go through Ganga's and then take the questions?
I'm okay with whichever one.
Also, want to keep him on track. So do you guys want to take questions at the end, maybe?
I'm okay with whichever way.
Ganga, what do you prefer? Is Ganga on? Hey, Gangaraju, can you hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute.
No worries.
Yeah, so some of the concepts, they may have more clarity after we explain the US taxation.
Okay. Yeah,
if you are okay, we can.
I agree.
Okay, great. Thank you, Isha. It's a great presentation. You made it extremely easy with case study examples and FAQs. It was extremely informative. And thank you, Kavita, for organizing this informative webinar. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Gangaraju Annamaya. Kavita, can you please check, am I audible? Am I okay?
Perfect. Sorry.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk more on. Isha already covered the Indian parts of repatriation process. Now I'll cover a little bit on the US taxes and other associated compliance requirements that is applicable for the US taxpayers. Before I jump into my presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about myself and my team. So we have a team of 25 tax professionals, CPAs and EAs, tax associates working on US tax services. We have office in Houston. Primarily, I'm from Katy, if you know, suburb of Houston. We have office in Katy, Sugarland. We have office in Dallas, Denver, and we have opened a new office in California and Chicago. We use latest technology. The idea is to give them very good experience for our client, and at the same time, we need to have a more secured environment because we deal with, the confidential information. We do understand the confidential information is extremely important, so we use latest technology software. I'm from EY, and some of the software we use or the technology we use, we have adopted from the Big Four platform. We do have clients, about 1,500 clients. We are serving them on individual and business tax returns. We serve our client on bookkeeping and accounting, and we also assist our client on auditing and other assurance services. Our vision is to be the trusted partner in the tax, bookkeeping, and payroll services by adding value in everything we do for our client. So coming back to the compliance side, Isha has explained the compliance requirement that is applicable for an Indian resident or person of Indian origin.
1 second. Is everybody able to see the deck? Because I am, and I have a couple of people who are not able to. Is it just Piyush who's not able to because everybody else able to? Yes. Okay. Most people can see it. No problems. Please go ahead. I just wanted to make sure. It's only Piyush, there's something wrong on your end.
Okay. Thank you. So some of the compliance requirements that you need to keep in mind, Isha already covered the international compliance for US taxpayers. Indian tax laws she already covered. So here in the US, the taxpayer needs to be concerned or be aware on the federal and state laws. State laws could be more relevant if you are in the income tax state, something like California, Chicago, or any other state. Texas is no income tax, so you don't need to worry about many compliance for the Texas resident. But other state, if you are a resident of other state where the incomes are taxable in your state, you also need to be aware or consider the state tax rules. So the non-compliance, if you don't do certain things, and there are some consequences that may create from IRS and also your state. Start with a simple letter notification, and it may be resultant in various other areas like examination, audit, penalty, negotiations, and you may need to get into offer and compromise to release or resolve your tax matters. So some of the tax law that is applicable related to the international compliance that is topic of the today is which we are going to help for many of our clients is on the FBAR, foreign bank account reporting. Repatriation is already covered. So FATCA, this FATCA is applicable if you have more than $100,000 for a married couples. The $100,000 balance in your foreign financial account. I'll talk a little bit about in the coming slide. If you have a mutual fund investment in India or outside of United States, IRS treats this as a PFIC, passive foreign investment company. You may need to be aware about the additional compliance requirement for the mutual fund you have invested outside of United States. Gift and inheritance, disclosure is required. Non-disclosure is subject to penalties. 5471 and 5472 is more applicable if you have an interest in a foreign entity, if you have a ownership in a foreign entity, or a foreign person having a ownership in US entity may subject to 5472 guidelines. And one more compliance that everybody need to keep in mind is, and this is slightly neglected, is reporting worldwide income. Many of you in these presentations who are in the US are US tax residents. you need to be aware that being a US tax resident, irrespective of the visa status you have, you must report worldwide income. When I say worldwide income, I'm not saying you will be paying tax on the worldwide income. The key word you need to remember is you need to report worldwide income. There is a treaty between US and India. So you will be eligible to get foreign tax credit. If you are paying a taxes like Isha has explained, 20 to 28% taxes, you will get the credit on your US tax return. But most important point here is you need to report worldwide income. Today, my focus area is on mainly on FBAR and FATCA. Since Isha covered repatriation, I don't spend much time on the repatriation. All these points have already been covered. But if you want to discuss any of this topic, feel free to contact us. Now, jumping on to FBAR and FATCA, there are some guidelines. These guidelines have been established as part of Banking Secrecy Act. Being a US taxpayer, you need to aware about all these guidelines, and you should, IRS is enforcing all these guidelines. Not being compliant with IRS leads to penalties and notices. So if you plan it well, if you be prepared, these topics are not extremely difficult. These are all extremely easy and convenient for most of the taxpayer, but only thing is it's a process. You need to be aware about the process and you need to plan for your process. If you can take care of these simple steps, you can achieve the peace of mind. So a little bit background about FBAR. I know many of you in this group are aware, have heard FBAR, foreign bank account reporting, a couple of times while filing your tax returns. But I just want to cover the basics or fundamental points or the key points of FBAR. This FBAR, the rule was introduced in 1970 as part of Banking Secrecy Act. This guidelines is applicable for both individuals as well as business owners. The form you need to use to report FBAR is FinCEN 114. Earlier, there is a different form, but from last couple of years, the form has been changed. And the due date to file the FBAR form is April 15th, the same due date when you file your income tax return in the United States. And it should be electronically filed. There is no option. There were times where you need to paper mail the FBAR form, but now you cannot paper mail. If you are paper mailing like the way you used to do traditionally, you are considered as a non-submission. So you should electronically file the FBAR form. Not reporting FBAR form subject to two types of penalties. One is willful violation and the non-willful violation. This willful violation and non-willful violation, IRS has given a detailed explanation what is willful violation and what is non-willful violation. It is extremely difficult if you get into any audit. It is extremely difficult to prove that you have a non-willful violation because I deal with I have involved in more than 5,000 FBAR compliance process in my career. So IRS asks 80 to 120 questions to decide whether it is a willful or non-willful. It is not just based on one fact. It is based on the combination of factors that will decide whether you had a willful violation or a non-willful violation. For some reason, if IRS decide that it is a willful violation, willful is nothing but intentionally not filing an FBAR form, the penalties can be as greater as $100,000 or 50% of the balance in your account. And if you are lucky, if you considered as a non-willful violation, and the penalty is still higher, that is $10,000 per violation. Coming back to FATCA, FATCA is an extension version of FBAR. FBAR will be submitted to IRS. FBAR will be submitted to US Treasury, and FATCA will be submitted to the separate department, that is, IRS. The form we use is 8938. I have given a brief chart here. If you are living in the US and if you are filing a married filing joint tax return, you should look at the year-end balance $100,000 or 150K, whichever is. If you meet one of these criteria, you will have a FATCA filing requirement. And to consider this $100,000 or 150K, you should include all your foreign financial account. The financial account includes the bank account, saving bank, the FD you have outside of United States, the demat account, the life insurance policy, cash value of life insurance policy, public provident fund, all the value to be combined. And if the value exceed $100,000 or 150K anytime during the year, you must file. And especially in the year you sell the properties in India, like Isha has explained, those year there is a high chance that you will be meeting FBAR as well as FATCA guidelines. It is extremely important for you to be compliant with the FBAR as well as FATCA. Otherwise, for some reason, if you miss this FBAR and FATCA after a couple of years, IRS may demand the penalties. It could be willful or non-willful, and both FBAR and non-FBAR and FATCA penalty could be applicable. This is going to be a severe stroke for any of the individuals. So I request the individuals who are having a financial account outside of United States, or if you are receiving money as part of gift or inheritance, or if you have sold any of the properties in India, please ensure that you are be compliant with FBAR and FATCA. This is what I was talking about, the reportable account. So I already briefly covered, so I'll just quickly go over because it is extremely important. For deciding the $100,000 for FATCA, $10,000 for FBAR, you should count your balance you have. These are all the balance you have in your saving account, checking account, and fixed deposits. You should consider the mutual fund or similar pool fund that is available to the general public. You should also include the brokerage account or demat account and a life insurance policy or account held with a foreign branch of a US financial institutions. Example is Citibank. Citibank is a US bank and it has a branch in India. And if you have an account with the Citibank, you should include the balance you had with Citibank to consider the $10,000 threshold. Some of the fact for FBAR, I've been using two threshold. One is $10,000 and $100,000. Please don't get confused. That FBAR threshold is $10,000 and FATCA threshold is $100,000. And even though FBAR is required to be reported, if you just have a signature authority on someone's account, let's say you have your parents having a bank account and you are the signature authority, then you must file the FBR form disclosing the account where you are a signature authority. The FATCA, this is something IRS is aggressively working on. IRS has signed up a contract with most of the countries, including 77,000 banks worldwide. So they are continuously collecting information of a US taxpayers. If you, for some reason, if you don't report because you are unaware about these rules, IRS do collect all this information in the back end. If IRS found that you had a foreign financial account and you are required to report FBAR or FATCA, and if you missed, there are 100 ways for the IRS to find out that and do any examination, and also they may assess penalties. So don't take this. Until 2010 or 2008, people were a little negligent about this FBAR and FATCA. But these days, in this digital electronic world, it is difficult to hide or to escape from the IRS any of these guidelines. So we have been talking about FBAR and FATCA. I told you you need to disclose. If they have not disclosed, there are penalties. But there is one solution. If you realize that there are foreign financial account to be reported or FATCA to be reported, if you are not done in any of the prior years, there is a amnesty program. This program was introduced in 2009 for the first time, and there were continuously the revisions or changes have been made. Currently, most of the taxpayer will qualify for a streamlined filing procedure. IRS has simplified the entire program, and they have introduced a streamlined filing procedure in the year 2014. This streamlined filing procedure, most of the individuals will qualify. There is a pre-screening requirement. We need to first assess the violation in the prior year. We need to understand the reason, and they have given the guidelines for the non-willful violations to be considered for the streamlined filing procedure. Streamlined filing procedure make the taxpayer to be compliant for all the prior years. For any reason you are not filed FBAR or FATCA, you must consider participating in the streamlined filing procedure. Being a IRS enrolled agent, I can help you to get that non-willful certificate. I can certify based on the facts and circumstances. Certainly there will be an interview process. We will review your tax document and we can help you to participate in the streamlined filing procedure and clear non-compliance for all the prior years. If anybody want to know the consequences of not filing in FBAR, or if you want to participate in the streamlined filing procedure, you should contact your tax consultant and know your options being compliant. So I have few examples to make these rules much easier. Many of you might be aware about it, but for the benefit of all the participants, I have come up with few examples. Example number one, I have 6 different accounts, but no account has more than $10,000 max in the year. Do I need to file FBAR? So remember, the $10,000 threshold, this is for FBAR, is a combined value of all your account, not in just one account. So if the combined value of your account exceeds $10,000 anytime during the year, you must file an FBAR. When I meet taxpayers at the time of filing the return, they always say that none of my account exceeded $10,000. That's why I have not filed it. So you're wrong. If any of the taxpayers are thinking on those lines, they have a misunderstanding on the guidelines. So IRS always looks at the combined value, the total value of all the account. And second, I received a huge amount of money as part of inheritance. This money is not my money. Do I need to report FBAR? As I told you, once any money, whether it is your money or your relatives have given you a loan, if that hits your bank account, so then you should disclose whether you are the real owner or someone is the real owner. As long as it's appearing in your bank account, you should report. And IRS is not asking you to pay tax on the balance you have in your account. In the FBAR, it is just a disclosure. You don't pay single dollar tax on the balance you have or the money you have in your account. So the tax calculation is completely different. I'm talking about disclosure. If the money is sitting in your account, if the account has your name, either as a joint account holder or you have a signature authority, then you must consider reporting FBAR and also the FATCA. So next example, my parents have a lot of money and I am a nominee in that account and I have signature authority, POA. This is not my account, do I need to report? If you carefully see the definition states that if you have a signature authority or any authority over a foreign financial account, it's better to report. Example number 4, I have mutual fund maintained or managed by my bank in India. I have a life insurance policy, cash surrender value. Do I need to declare FBAR? So normally common taxpayers assume that FBAR stands for foreign bank account reporting. They think that this is applicable only for the bank account. Actually, that is not true. This foreign bank account reporting also applicable for all the financial institutions where you have your ownership or you have your name associated. So anything and everything kept in a financial institutions, the life insurance policy or the surrender value or the cash value of the life insurance policy must be considered reporting on FBAR form. Next question, I have a stock certificate issued by a foreign company which meets FBAR threshold. I have declared on FBAR. So here, see, if there is a stock certificate issued by a foreign company, if it is a paper certificate, earlier days, it used to be a case where the stocks were not dematerialized, so it was not dematted. So if you have a physical copy of the stock certificate, if it is not linked to any financial institutions, for FBAR, you don't need to report the paper stock. If it is dematted, if it is in a demat format, then you need to file FBAR. If it is in a paper format, you don't need to report. And I have a final, the last example. I own more than 50% stock in a domestic corporation that meets all FBAR requirement. Additionally, the company already filed an FBAR. Do I need to declare? So here again, it's another challenging situation where the company owning the foreign bank account and the taxpayer is the signature authority. Even though company filed an FBAR form, since the taxpayer is having a signature authority on the financial account, again you need to declare the foreign bank account on this individual FBAR. Some of the myths about FBAR, and I've been hearing this from many of my clients when I meet them for the first time. So they say that, FBAR, I recently heard, is it a new law? Actually the FBAR is one of the oldest implement that was introduced in 1970 as part of Banking Secrecy Act. But until 2008, until the financial burst, so the FBAR was not having too much importance, but IRS is not paying too much attention on the non-filers of foreign bank account. But from effective 2008, IRS came to know that there are lots of US taxpayers having money outside, and they came to know that IRS is losing the revenue or not having a control on that money they have owned by the US taxpayers. So that's when IRS becomes serious, and from 2009 onwards, IRS started continuous effort to bring this on streamline. So just to tell you, this is not a new law. It was there from 1970, but IRS is more serious and enforcing. If you have not filed FBAR, you should consider correcting your mistake sooner or later. The second, I have not filed FBAR all this year. Am I in trouble? No. IRS has introduced an amnesty program. This amnesty program is mainly for the innocent taxpayers who have not aware about all these guidelines. And this amnesty program is a voluntary disclosure. Before IRS imposing any penalties or before IRS imposing any examination, an innocent taxpayer voluntarily participate in the amnesty program. They'll get preferential treatment, and they will have an opportunity to clear non-compliance for the prior year. And the third, I have filed my tax extension. FBAR is automatically extended. The answer is yes. So if you filed an extension for filing your income tax return, you will get an automatic extension for your FBAR. So you will have a FBAR filing due date extended to October 15th of the following year. Next, I will not easily get caught if I have not filed FBAR. This is one of the the wrong assumption with many of the taxpayers. IRS as the various source, they will know about foreign financial account information. IRS is working continuously with all the countries, foreign countries, and also the bank. In the previous slide, I mentioned more than 77,000 banks are participating in the IRS program. So they are sharing the US taxpayer information directly to IRS. In your background, the information is getting exchanged. And also, I've heard a couple of times that when you enter to the US, some of the in the immigration, they may ask the questions, and they will check your if they found any of the financial instrument, they may do the thorough examination. And the second is when you go for US passport renewal or a visa or a green card, so there is a declaration I've seen these days, and you need to declare. If you give a wrong declaration, there is a chance that your visa or green card will be at risk. And also, they have the rights to examine, and if they examine, if they found there is a the non-compliant, you will be at risk. And also there are IRS has identified the bad bank list, especially the HSBC bank. They've identified as a bad bank list. So IRS already have the data of all this information. The only thing is they need to examine, and they need to do the send the letters to the applicable taxpayers. But during this process, if you voluntarily participate in the amnesty program, so you have a chance or opportunity to clear non-compliance for the prior year. And the next, can I criminally prosecute it for FBAR non-compliance? The theoretical answer is yes, but in most IRS, I know the fact that there are millions of people who are not filed, but if you are a taxpayer where you think you don't want to take any risk, because IRS has all rights to criminally prosecute for a willful violation, but if you don't want to take any risk, it is better to participate in the amnesty program and clear non-compliance for the prior year. I think with this, I conclude my presentation. If you want to know more about our company, our services, our team, please visit our website, www.righttaxmate.com. Again, myself, Gangaraju, and my colleague and partner, Mr. Kumar, also in this call. Call us. You can talk to one of us. We will provide more detailed explanation of any of the topics which we discussed, or if you need any help on the US taxes, please feel free to contact us. Or you can send an email to info@righttaxmate.com. If you want to take an appointment, you can get the link in our website. Or if you want to do an in-person appointment, you can contact us at our KT office. Thank you, everyone. I know we have very less time for the questions, but I will be available to answer any of your questions we have. I think Isha also available. She can answer any of the questions from the India side, and I can take up the US side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ganga. First of all, thank you very much for the very comprehensive information. I know I learned a lot today, and I hope you all learned too. We'll also go through the questions today. We have about 20 questions or 17, 18 questions. So let's get started with that. A quick question is, can a PIO be a US citizen? Of course. I think I know the answer to that. Isha can verify.
Yes, you're right.
I'm a PIO. I mean, or I have an OCI, so it's the same thing.
Yeah.
All right. What defines real estate trading?
Okay, so real estate trading means owning more than one house, and then maybe being in the business of buying and selling houses in India. That is real estate trading.
Okay.
Like any other business trading, basically.
Basically, is there a frequency of buying and selling that qualifies, or is it just a, let's say I buy because of an investment and then I sell it after a long time? Does that qualify as trading, or is there a certain frequency that I have to buy and sell?
So it is the frequency and the intention both. So for example, if I want to do real estate trading, I can have 10 properties in India. I can be renting them out. I can be using them for self-use. That is not necessarily considered as a real estate trading. But if I buy a house, maybe I repair it, renovate it, and sell it again immediately or in a couple of years, something like that is real estate trading, where I don't give it on rent at all. Okay. Where I simply
flip kind of a situation.
Yeah, something like that. Correct.
Got it. Shakti asked, do I need to pay tax for both countries in India and US if I repatriate any amount from a land sale?
Yes, you need to pay taxes both in India and US. And as I think Gangaraju also mentioned, there is a tax treaty between India and US. So if you do pay taxes in India on that, you will get the tax credit in the US. But the computation mechanism in India and US are different. So in India, as I explained, you can claim your index cost, you can claim your expenses, and whatever is the balance, you have to pay the tax on that at 20% plus, applicable surcharge and cess. And Gangaraju can explain that how the computation mechanism works in the US, and also how you can take the credit in the US.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there is a treaty between US and India. So India taxation, as Isha has explained, the tax computation will be computed first in India. In US, based on the holding period, and in US, the holding period for a short term is less than a year, or less than a year is considered as a short term. More than a year considered as a long term. Long-term capital gain generally is taxed at 15%, and depends on your AGI, total income. It may go up to 20%. And also there is no indexation concept in the United States, but you can take advantage of the exchange rate. So in the US, you need to first calculate the tax on the capital gain or the India source income. And we will compare with the India tax that you have paid on the same income. Whichever is lower, whether it is a US tax or India tax, will be considered as a credit. So most cases, I would say generally 90 to 95% of the time, you don't need to pay taxes in the US, but again, it completely depends on the actual numbers. If you can contact us, we will prepare the computation and we will let you know the eligible credit that you can claim on your US tax returns.
That makes sense. Thank you. Another question from Sakti is, if my life insurance corporation policy matured and that money deposited in my NRO account, how can I repatriate that money to the US? Should I pay the tax in US for the insurance maturity amount?
So from a repatriation perspective, it will come under the 1 million USD per financial year. In India, depending upon the kind of life insurance policy, most are actually not chargeable to tax under Indian tax laws, but I would let Gangaraju explain the US perspective.
Yeah, US generally is the other way. Most of the life insurance policies, especially the foreign life insurance policy, is subject to tax because IRS won't consider that as a qualified life insurance as per IRS. You may need to pay tax on it. But there will be a computation. We need to understand what would be your contribution, whether it's a pre-tax or post-tax, and we need to see the the gain you made from that policy. Most of the life insurance policy are unit-based life insurance policy. You need to see. We need to compute your contribution plus the gain you made, and some of the life insurance policy qualify as a PFIC, passive foreign investment company, as per US tax law. It not only at the time of maturity, even though when you are holding the life insurance, you will have additional compliance requirement in the United States. So if you have any of these life insurance which are unit based, you should one, reporting on the FBAR, FATCA if applicable, and also you should report as a PFIC on your US tax return during the holding period of your life insurance policy.
So there's not only requirements to report when you actually repatriate it, but also when you hold it, depending on the amounts.
Yeah, yes.
As an NRI, OCI, can I sell self-acquired property in India to another OCI person?
Yes, you can, but other than agricultural property.
Not lot land, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, agricultural land, sorry.
I have a question specific to how tax will work in India and then in the US. I think might have covered this with between both of you. I think this was asked when Isha was talking. Let's say I sold my parents' inherited property, want to move the money to the US. How does the tax apply? So I think a lot of this was covered. You will get credits based on, you'll have to pay in India and then you'll get credits in the US. You'll still have to file in the US. So how much you need to file, I think you should go to Ganga and they'll probably work it out. How would a foreign citizen who is deemed a resident Indian per ITAT repatriate proceeds from a sale of a property?
So basically somebody who's a foreign citizen but deemed to be a resident in India, so there is a different residential status concept under income tax and under FEMA, which is the Foreign Exchange Management Act. I would believe that if this person is a resident under Indian tax laws, would also be a resident under Indian FEMA. If that is the case, then the 1 million USD scheme does not apply to them. They have another lower LRS limit called liberalized remittance scheme of $250,000 per financial year. So they can only remit under the USD 250,000 per financial year. 1 million is not applicable to you if you are considered a resident in India.
Thank you. Chetan asked, can you explain how we calculate US tax on the sale? I think Gangaraju kind of went through this, so I'm not going to. So the US taxes are based on the taxation, the bracket that, that as Gangaraju explained, like the tax bracket in the US. So, and then you'll get the credits appropriately. I'll skip that one. Jitun says, should NRE, NRO accounts be filed via FBAR form?
Yes, I'm sorry, NRE, NRO account, also considered as a financial account. These must be included on the FPR form.
As long as they have the limits there, right? The 10,000.
Correct.
You mentioned you've gone through 5,000 audits. Do you know how these audits are typically started? Any triggering factors for, he says RBAR, I assume FBAR audits?
So there are various sources IRS gets that information. Whenever IRS gets the information, they start with kind of sending a letter and asking for more information. As a taxpayer, you will have the responsibility to provide all the information to IRS. Some of the trigger point I would think of based on my experience is especially when you repatriate the money, when the large amount of money coming into your bank account. So that could be a one trigger point. IRS may wants to know whether you are fully compliant with all your prior year compliance requirement. They may want to know about it when you report, or you are sending money from US to India. You have sent it regularly, and they may check whether you had reported the FBAR if it is applicable. The second thing is when you file the tax return, randomly IRS picks your return, and they have a random audit picking mechanism. So they may ask a question whether you filed an FPR form. And another scary part here is there are whistleblowers. The whistleblowers get compensated if they provide an information of a taxpayer, and then in turn, if IRS collect any penalty or tax based on the information provided by the whistleblowers. So, IRS will incentivize or pay commission for the whistleblowers. So you are open or explored for various sources, or IRS will have this information coming from various directions. So being a taxpayer, my primary focus or my advice for everybody is don't think how IRS will know about it. There are 100 ways for the IRS to know all this information. So you should look at, what is the compliance requirement, whether IRS will know or not. So you should look at, to be on the safer side, to have a peace of mind. You should disclose voluntarily so that, you don't need to worry about any uncertainties at later point of time.
All right. Lots of similar questions. So I'm trying to kind of filter it out. For FBAR, do we report the PPF, PF? Are they not Social Security?
Employer provided provident fund are exempted, but there are public provident fund which you created outside of the employer provident fund are required to be disclosed on the FBAR.
So the PPF is required to be reported, but not the PF.
Correct.
All right. Is there a deadline for FATCA 2020? That's, I assume it's your tax deadline. Does FATCA
Correct.
2020 need to be filed with the tax returns? The answer is yes. After
Yes.
all, tax returns are due by October 20th. If you file an extension, it's due by October 15th, right?
Yes. Yeah. The due date, if you have filed an extension, the due date is October 15th.
Otherwise, it was July 15th.
Only for COVID, it is July 15th. Otherwise, the regular due date is April 15th.
Correct. Just for this year. All right. There's a few more questions. Any tax implications in the US when you repatriate? I think we've already answered that question. There is tax implications. You have to still file it. Sold an empty plot in India, they only register for government market value, even though you paid more. Also, dollar to rupee conversion, you have losses, but as per India registration and sale deed, it shows profit in India. Can I take losses here based on what I actually paid? I think that's a good question. So the person
I can answer the US side. Yes, because of the currency exchange rate, if you incur a loss, the loss, you can take it, if it is an investment property, you can take it as a capital loss. And again, you may not able to claim all the losses during the current year, but you can take the loss, you can offset with any other gain or carry forward to the next year.
So is it the same, like capital losses can only offset capital gain, or they can they offset ordinary income?
No, only you can claim up to $3,000,
Oh,
the capital loss, or you can offset with any other capital gain.
got it. And then you carry forward what you cannot use.
Yes.
Right. Okay. How do you know the bank amount in the bank in India has 10K when the currency is in INR? How to calculate the exchange rate? When I guess
IRS has published the year-end exchange rate. If you go to IRS website and exchange rate, you will see the published exchange rate. You should use the FBAR or year-end exchange rate to arrive at the $10,000 threshold.
it's good to know. I purchased a house in India in 2010, but did not disclose in FATCA. Should I start disclosing? If so, how can I start?
See, the FATCA, you need to report only the financial account. You send the money in the bank account and you use that money to purchase a house. Until the money was in your bank account, you need to disclose to the on the FATCA as well as in the FBR form. Once you purchased it, and the following year, if you do not have the balance, then you don't need to file FBAR every year. So you need to always look at from January to December whether you are meeting $10,000 or $100,000 threshold. If you meet the threshold every year, then you should file FBAR every year. If you don't have for some of the period you're not meeting the threshold, then you don't need to file FBAR or FATCA.
So let's say going back to 2010, he put the money from his US account to the purchase, moved to India. Now it was reportable because it met the $10,000 limit, but he ended up purchasing the property. But now there's nothing in the account. So does he go back to 2010 and report FBAR, or does he just do nothing right now?
There is a 6-year statute of limitation. So he will carry the risk. If he wants to clear non-compliance, there are other ways. There are the OEDP programs, so you can participate. But IRS normally looks at the 6-year statute of limitation. So we will go back only 6 years as part of the streamlined filing procedure. So if the non-compliant comes as part of 6 years, then we will recommend to participate in the streamlined filing procedure, report the FBAR, and clear non-compliance for the prior year. So 2010, technically you need to correct, but I have seen many of the taxpayers have not fixed for 2010, and they are completely okay. It is not a recommended answer, but you can take a chance because the statute of limitation is 6 years.
Got it. Question for Ganga. If FBAR and FATCA are not filed and started filing last couple of years, once we start filing, are we in compliance?
Once you start filing, you are in compliance for that year onwards. As I told you earlier, there is a 6-year statute of limitation. So IRS can always come back anytime during the 6 years. And this also, when you file your FBAR and FATCA, this is also be a trigger point for the IRS. Once you report, they may automatically ask, what about prior year? So if that prior year within that 6 years, you will be at risk. So my recommendation is, if you know you need to file FBAR, definitely you should start filing it from current year, and also look for prior 6 years, whether you are compliant. If you're not compliant, you should fix it.
So it's 6 plus the current year. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
In 2012, I transferred USD funds to India to buy a house in India. Do I require to file FBAR now? I think it's the same answer. It's more than 6-year period. There's no point in doing FBAR right now. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you please speak a little bit more about insurance policies? Which insurance policies are PFIC? I don't know what that is. If LIC is considered PFIC, or is it based on a specific policy?
Passive foreign investment company, IRS has a separate rules. The full form of PFIC is passive foreign investment company. Basically, if you have a insurance policy where the your funds are used to generate a passive income, in simple words, it is considered as a PFIC as per IRS. The LIC will invest in various other investments, and they generate interest dividend, and then they will pay you your share of the profit or the agreed terms. Based on the terms, they will pay you. So most of the life insurance policy, qualify to be treated as a PFIC. If the life insurance policy treated as a PFIC, mainly if you have a unit-based life insurance policy, then definitely it will be treated as a PFIC. And once it is treated as a PFIC, the taxation is completely different. You may need to declare it separately on the PFIC, and also you may need to pay tax on the unrealized gain. And there are different methods or election you need to make, unrealized gain or a default method. So it gets more complicated. If you can contact us and give us your own information, we can investigate, and then we can tell you what are the actual steps to be taken care to mitigate this compliance requirement.
All right, I think we have to kind of cut off the questions right now. Ganga and Isha, can you please share your contact information, because I'm getting a lot of people asking for it and I don't think they quite caught it. I will also send the contact information via email with the recording, but Ganga, could you please put that up really quick, and after that, Isha, just so people take a screenshot, do something, please. There you go. It's
Sure.
right. Taxmate.com. It's pretty easy to remember. If you go to writetaxmate.com, you have all the information there. Isha, could
Yes.
you share your information as well?
Sure. I'm just stopping your screen share. Yeah. There you go.
Please take a screenshot or take notes. All right. I think that was an amazing amount of information. I took a lot of notes, and I think I didn't probably do everything right in 2012, but it's probably too late. It's over the 6-year period, thankfully. But thank you so much, guys. I just got like a ton of information, and I hope all the viewers got a ton of value from this. I know we are way over our time, but this is an amazing amount of information. So thank you, Isha, for the early morning call, and thank you, Ganga, for the late night call and for staying on so long and answering. I think we got through 31 questions, and there are more coming in. So if you guys need to reach out, please reach out to Ganga and Isha separately and talk about your specific situation. We just want to give a broader awareness of the topic and the things you need to worry about. But for your specific information or situation, I would always contact them directly. Again, thank you all for staying so late night, and I hope this was useful for you. I appreciate the time you take away from your families to be here. I will see you next on October 8th for our panel discussion with our 3 immigrants. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kavita. Thank you.
Thanks, Ganga Raji. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.